Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith-Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. In a recent story in The Atlantic headlined Inside the USAID Fire Sale, editor Hana Kiros looks into what has happened to the millions of dollars of USAID property, from medication to cars to water pumps and generators, after USAID abruptly closed this spring. She talks with Stephanie Desmon about stockpiles of taxpayer-funded supplies either wasted, destroyed, or in many cases still unaccounted for in the chaos. Let's listen. Hana Kiros, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
So today, what I really want to do is talk about an article that you wrote for The Atlantic. It's called Inside the USAID Fire Sale, which of course is an intriguing headline. Start by sort of laying the landscape for those of us who are not as familiar with what's going on at USAID.
Yeah, so at the start of the year, USAID was a government agency that employed 10,000 employees and was running foreign aid projects in over 100 countries. And in February, most of those staff were fired. Soon after, 5,000 or so foreign aid projects around the world were abruptly canceled. And I went into the piece that you mentioned, just thinking about, what happened to all of this stuff involved? Foreign aid work involves things like mosquito nets, motorbikes to reach people in rural villages, water towers, water pumps. And when an aid project ends, that stuff is the property of the U.S. government. But all of the people that normally would officiate handing this stuff off were being fired. And then the aid groups that might have been overseeing the items were also laying off staff en masse. So I just was sort of like, okay, well, where did all of these things go? And the piece was an attempt to trace that.
So where are they supposed to go? I assume that the USAID is not shipping all this stuff back to Washington under normal circumstances. But where is it supposed to go?
So normally when a foreign aid project ends, it's something that's anticipated. You start preparing a year in advance. You have an inventory of all of the items. Normally the start dates and end dates are staggered so that you're not running 5,000 closeouts at once. Typically what you might do is an organization might have another project that's going to continue. And so you say, okay, maybe these USAID vehicles could go to this other project. Hey, this generator might be useful for this other hospital we're running. Or USAID really liked to, rather than buying things anew, if you're in Kenya, maybe passing it on to another USAID project in Kenya. So it's typically something that's very methodical, and you'd be giving these goods to just other humanitarian partners in an area that can make good use of them.
That's not what's happening here.
Yeah, well, I think that the closeouts of these projects were very chaotic. And there are some staff that have, in some cases, managed to drop off items to like a local minister of health or maybe to a hospital. But in many cases in my reporting, I found that hasn't been the case. So, for example, in Afghanistan alone, there was a report that recently came out from the Inspector General Office, so like the government watchdog audits, this stuff that over $100 million of equipment was just abandoned in the field. I spoke with different aid groups that said they ultimately had to incinerate medicine because they were waiting for orders from the U.S. government for months to figure out, okay, this isn't our legal property. Like, can we move this? Can we not? And they never received a response. So it seems like a lot of goods are going to waste. And something I found really striking is that Ukraine is the country that USAID has historically given the most money to the past few years because of the war there. And in a federal report, the U.S. government said that projects that involved over $100 million worth of stuff that were providing food, shelter, clean water, their status was, they weren't terminated, they weren't active, it was unknown. So it seems like just because of how sudden and chaotic this collapse has been, there are a lot of items that are just in the field and haven't been transferred to anyone.
I know that one of the things we heard from politicians about why USAID had to go was because of quote unquote fraud and waste. This feels like a lot of waste. What did the State Department have to say when you discussed that with them?
I didn't get much in the way of specifics from the State Department when I reached out to them for comment. They confirmed many of the things that I found in my reporting. One of the things that I found is that the U.S. was paying 80 cents per day per vehicle to store hundreds of cars in a car park in Nepal. These were cars that, for example, organizations like Helen Keller International, they would drive to like rural parts of Nepal and screen children for malnutrition. Their project was canceled. The cars got impounded. I asked, how do you justify this cost? And the questions like that weren't really engaged with. But I think one of the main complaints about USAID is, USAID is giving money. Like the concerns about the fact that what if USAID projects are being used to the benefit of terrorists? But it seems like the potential for that has increased pretty significantly now that, for example, there are all of these people mentioned specifically that there are water pumps that use solar panels, and that the solar panels being looted and sold for parts is something that they're particularly concerned about. And it seems like the potential for waste and abuse has only ballooned now that no one is watching this stuff.
And there's a lot of projects that were sort of half done. Is that right? I mean, for example, they were constructing water pipes water pumps.
This is something that people in USAID that were recently fired have spoken to me about and that they're particularly concerned about, because the U.S. government came in, they said, we're going to build a well in, let's say, Kenya or the DRC. And those water projects have received bipartisan support in Congress. Money's been appropriated to do that work. They dug a hole 200 meters deep in a community. The well was never finished. The U.S. government said, abandon this immediately. And now there's concern that if a child falls in some countries they were able to cover them, but in a lot of countries that hasn't happened. And there's also concern about, let's say, flooding, the water supply in an entire community being contaminated because of projects that have been abandoned. I think that there are a lot of concerns about what's happening next, but the people that were working on these projects that were investing in these communities, they don't have eyes on this anymore because they've been recalled back to the U.S. So there's just a lot of unfinished stuff with the USAID logo on it around the world.
So a lot of this stuff is branded USAID, right? And unsavory things might be happening with them. And I'm curious what kind of PR problem that could create overseas.
Yeah, so reputational risk is something that the federal watchdogs that have been, raising alarm about the process that's been happening. That's one thing that they've raised because, there are hundreds of health facilities that have closed now that have the USAID logo on them, that would have, an American flag on them. A lot of USAID's projects included branding that said, from the American people. So it's very possible that people are showing up to health clinics that are shuttered that have the American flag on them and feeling that the U.S. has really abandoned them. And one of the things that I previously reported on is the fact that the U.S. government ordered the incineration of around 500 tons of food aid that was meant for children in Afghanistan and Pakistan because the food sat for 6 months during this chaos and just, it ultimately passed its expiration date and had to be destroyed. And one thing about that really struck me is that, this is food meant for children that says from the American people. It's from us to no one. There are items that have the American flag on them, the USAID logo, that are maybe sitting on the side of the road. Maybe they've been auctioned off. That's one aspect of this. The U.S. embassies are actually auctioning off a lot of this equipment that they recover to just any member of the public, the highest bidder. And it's very unclear where all of this stuff is going.
You talked about burning of food, and I keep seeing things like we're going to destroy tons of contraception. We're going to destroy Mpox vaccines. And just as a human being, that makes my blood boil, right? Is this really the only option? Or could there be a system put in place to ensure this doesn't happen?
There was a system in place to ensure that this never happened. USAID ran a global health supply chain that was really robust and a lot of contracts that helped support that. So the contracts for warehousing, the contracts for drivers to deliver medicine to places, a lot of links in that chain have been broken. Even contracts with companies that would ship food from the US overseas, a lot of links in that chain have now been broken. Some of this work is continuing in the State Department, but the infrastructure that supported it has really been blown up. So I think a lot of their work going forward is just trying to remake that, which will be difficult because putting that all together took at least a decade. And, in the case of medicine, food, I think it really depends on there are rules that are in place that, typically make sense because you really don't want to ship medicine overseas if it'll spoil before it reaches people. National governments don't want to take on the burden of destroying this stuff themselves. You hate to see things be destroyed. There's no reason that they should be destroyed if, the system was still functional. But, if medicine goes bad, then in many cases it would be irresponsible to give it to people. So I think the onus is on the State Department and the federal government to try and prevent that from happening. Something I've heard from almost all of the aid workers that I've talked to is that ending a foreign aid program in and of itself isn't a sin. Reevaluating how the U.S. delivers foreign aid is on the table and something most new administrations do, but canceling the vast majority of it without any warning at all, without any transition in place is really the killer here. So an aid worker that I was speaking to in Sudan said that, if we'd had 6 months, if we'd had a year to prepare, we could have made sure that we didn't close soup kitchens that thousands of people were relying on for survival overnight. We could have made it so that children that were in emergency feeding programs weren't turned away. And in some cases, they've died because they were suddenly cut off from really essential healthcare that they needed. And national governments could have had an opportunity to consider, okay, the U.S. is pulling away. What can we do on our own? But what's happening now is a really urgent triaging of life where national governments are like, oh my God, we can't. Our healthcare system suddenly has a third of the money that it did before, or communities are saying, oh, we thought that we would have all of these healthcare workers and they've suddenly disappeared. The real tragedy of all of this is that it could have been done in a way that didn't lead to massive loss of life, but it seems like there was no real regard for trying to minimize that.
Do you feel like there can be progress in this at all? Are there solutions that are going to happen, or have we sort of gone past the point of no return?
Something that I think is interesting from earlier this year when Elon Musk was bragging about having shut down USAID, he held a space on his social media platform X, and he said basically, we're going to shut everything down, and if it turns out that we shut down something that was useful, people will get angry, and then we'll turn it back on. So, he very explicitly said that outrage is the lever through which foreign aid projects get turned back on. And I think that you can see examples of that. For example, like PEPFAR is this name brand foreign aid project that was started by George Bush that aims to reduce the AIDS burden around the world. And it's been wildly successful. And because people got mad about it, it seems it's still in trouble in many ways, but it's fared much better than other foreign aid work. And so I think that the way I see things working going forward is just if advocacy is really sustained. I think the general perception is, there's no constituency for USAID in the US, right? Like Americans, when a refugee camp stops getting water delivered, that is horrible for those people, but like Americans don't know about it, right? But I think that the way forward is just people saying, we think that it's a tragedy that taxpayer money went to buy food to feed people and now it's being burned, or we bought people medicine, we want them to get medicine. Like I think that's how things start getting turned back on.
Have you had a lot of reaction to your piece?
I've gotten more tips about other things to follow up on, mobile health clinics that have been abandoned, which are like hospitals on wheels. One aid organization talked about working in South Sudan, having a very intricate system for like using like motorbikes and boats to reach areas that are flooded and having to get rid of all of that equipment and not really having anyone to give it to because there are so few aid organizations working there. A lot of the response has just been, this is frustrating. And it seems like, the USAID is, for all intents and purposes, dead at this point, but there is a small legacy organization that has like a few dozen employees, and their job is closing out all of the contracts, paying off all of the people who canceled leases on early. And so I think this is sort of an ongoing story. And, it'll take potentially years for the dust to settle. So I think the response has mostly been, this is crazy, and there's so much more.
Hana Kiros, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmon. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.